1900 and things in Europe are getting a bit tense. One reason was that a series of defensive alliances had been drawn up, meaning that the next European war was going to be a doozy. To make matters worse, several areas of contention could lead to the outbreak of said war. The first was the ongoing Anglo-German naval arms race, as the recently formed German Empire, ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II, sought to build a fleet large enough to challenge the Royal Navy. The second was French resentment over its loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany back in 1871. The third was the rivalry between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire for dominance in the Balkans. And the fourth was the rivalry between Britain and Russia for control of the Middle East. Knowing that a major war was potentially on the horizon, you'd think that the great powers of Europe, these nations, would act calmly to prevent that. But you'd be wrong. Over the following decade and a bit, there were several potential sparks for the outbreak of this war. France and Britain had signed some agreements, collectively known as the Entente Cordiale, which made them allies in foreign policy. But importantly, it wasn't a mutual defense pact. Soon after this, in 1905, came the first Moroccan crisis, in which Wilhelm II gave his support to Moroccan independence, which upset the French because they saw it as a part of their sphere of influence. It was agreed that Morocco would stay under French influence but with a foreign-run police force. 1907 saw Britain and Russia patch things up, where they divided the Middle East between them. Thus, it seemed that things were calming down. But then Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia in 1908 without consulting anyone, which led to Russia getting very annoyed. The Emperor of Austria-Hungary, Franz Joseph, was unsurprisingly furious, and the assassination gave him a pretext for war. With whom? Serbia. This was because it was assumed that Serbia, whom the Principe wanted Bosnia to be united with, had something to do with it. The turmoil that followed this is known as the July Crisis. As such, an ultimatum with a list of demands was issued to Serbia. Serbia refused, and on the 28th of July, Austria-Hungary declared war on them and Russia began to mobilize its military. Germany demanded they stop. They didn't, and on the 1st of August, Germany declared war on Russia. France then started to mobilize, and on the 3rd, Germany declared war on them too. The German plan for the war was simple. Hold off the Russians in the east while a large force cut through Luxembourg and Belgium in what was called the Schlieffen Plan. The idea was that the Germans would capture Paris and force a French surrender, after which they could turn their full might on the Russians, who would take a long time to mobilize. On the 4th, Germany entered Belgium after it refused to grant the passage of German troops. Britain had guaranteed Belgium's independence since 1830, but the Germans weren't expecting the British to be willing to go to war for it. They were wrong. By mid-August, the respective site of the war looked like this. You'll note that Italy hadn't come to the aid of the rest of the Triple Alliance, and the reason for this was that this was only a defensive pact, so Italy wasn't obligated to do anything. And so, they didn't. So trench warfare heavily favored the defenders, since to attack the enemy, soldiers had to go over the top and leave the safety of the trenches. They were then exposed to enemy machine guns, barbed wire, and all the other horrors of war. Both sides would spend a lot of time and money developing weapons and tactics to break the stalemate. On the Eastern Front, the Russian Empire did well at first and pushed into Germany. This advance came to a grinding halt at the Battle of Tannenberg, in which Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg crushed the Russian army. To the south, Austria-Hungary concentrated on attacking Serbia, which did not go well, and Russia advanced into the empire. Soon after this, the Central Powers received a boost when the Ottoman Empire entered the war on their side. Montenegro would also join the Entente. By the end of the year, the front lines looked like this. After this, the methods of fighting a modern war started to evolve rapidly. England was subject to Zeppelin raids, and Germany debuted the use of chlorine gas. The war wasn't just limited to Europe, though. Troops of the British and Russian empires were advancing into Ottoman lands, and both sides clashed in Africa as well. Japan also joined the war and nabbed all of the German colonies in the Pacific. In Australia, they captured New Guinea. Late 1915 saw Serbia finally fall, but not until Bulgaria joined the Central Powers and invaded from the south. The Russians, who had been struggling for a while, were now in mass retreat, and so Sunnis II decided that he would take personal charge to fix things. 1916 saw Montenegro conquered, a failed Easter Rising in Ireland, and attempts by both sides to break the deadlock on the Western Front. The Germans launched the Battle of Verdun, during which lots of people died for a whole load of nothing. Later, the British launched the Battle of the Somme, which was more of the same. Soon after this, Romania entered the war and was swiftly conquered. This was also the year that saw the main British and German fleets clash at the gargantuan Battle of Jutland, in which Germany attempted to break British naval dominance. They did not. Soon after this came the Brusilov offensive on the Eastern Front, which saw the Russians push back. Also, Franz Joseph proved that he could die and was succeeded by Charles I. 1916 was important from a technological standpoint because it saw the introduction of the tank by the British, and they were largely effective when they weren't breaking down. By 1917, everyone was getting a bit tired of this war stuff, but not much could be done since both sides wanted to remake the balance of power in Europe, which the other side could never accept. The Central Powers wanted Europe to look like this, and the Entente wanted this. The contempt for the war was particularly strong in Russia, and February saw rioting, which soon became the February Revolution. They saw Nicholas II abdicate, and Russia became a republic. The new provisional government there would, importantly, not end the war. Discontent wasn't limited to Russia, though. Austria-Hungary was coming apart at the seams, and in Germany, political pressures were dividing the country. This was exacerbated by the British naval blockade, which prevented Germany from importing the food it desperately needed, inducing hunger and starvation in certain parts of the country. Greece, after a lot of pressure, joined the war on the side of the Entente. The late year also saw the October Revolution, in which the communists seized control of Russia. Russia then withdrew from the war, and after long negotiations with the Central Powers, Russia ceded this territory. In 1918, Germany then launched the Spring Offensive against the intent to win the war before too many Americans arrived. A lot of people died, some land was taken, nothing changed, and the war dragged on. Austria-Hungary continued to break down, and most of the fronts were still at a stalemate. In southern Europe, Greek, Serbian, British, and French troops advanced into Bulgaria, which had its disgruntled population, and so it signed an armistice. The British were now advancing into the Ottoman Empire with the help of its rebelling Arabian population and the neighboring peoples under the guidance of T. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. The British had secured their help by promising them this land. The British had lied. By late October, the Entente had captured the important city of Damascus, and the Ottomans signed an armistice. 4 days later, after the Italians had finally pushed into Austro-Hungarian territory, Charles I signed an armistice. And about 6 seconds later, the empire fell apart. Realizing the war was lost, Wilhelm II abdicated on November the 11th. Germany signed an armistice, and the war was over. In 1919, the peace was formalized in the Treaty of Versailles, which limited the size of Germany's armed forces, demanded hefty reparations, and reduced its territory. The Treaty of Trianon divided the Hungarian half of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and gave territory to Romania and the new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovens, later known as Yugoslavia. The Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye divided the Austrian half, creating Czechoslovakia, giving territory to Poland and also Italy, but not as much as they had been promised. Bulgaria was stripped of this territory. The Ottoman Empire was supposed to lose this. The Turks refused to accept this, and a war broke out. The Turks won, and this became the Republic of Turkey, with the rest of the empire's territories going to Britain and France. The war had seen about 8 million military deaths, with Russia, Germany, and France seeing the lion's share. The war had been started over imperial pride. Millions of men had died in the vain hope of bringing their generals and emperors glory and a quick resolution to the war. Tactical inflexibility combined with revolutionary methods of waging war meant that scores of men who didn't have to die did so. With such a heavy price paid, what did the war achieve? Honestly, not much. It had brought about the death of 4 major empires and the rise of new nations from their ashes. Ultimately, what was once the greatest legacy was that he created the conditions necessary for the outbreak of World War II. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching. Special thanks to James Bissonette, Thomas Guest, Stritch, Adam Harvey, and Winston Cowood. If you'd like to know more about World War I, there are some book recommendations in the description below.